My sister looked me straight in the eyes the week before she died. She reached into her bedside drawer, took out an old leather diary, and pressed it into my hands. "Promise me," she whispered. "No matter what happens, never read it." I laughed softly back then. I thought it was only another one of her sentimental requests. So I locked the diary inside my bedroom closet and kept my promise for 18 years. I never opened it. Not once. Then, one rainy Thursday afternoon, someone knocked on my front door. A man I'd never seen before stood there holding an old black and white photograph. The first words out of his mouth made my blood run cold. "I believe," he said quietly, "your sister wrote my name in that diary." That moment, I realized the promise I had kept for almost 2 decades was about to destroy everything I believed I knew about my own family. My name is Evelyn Carter, and I am 78 years old. For most of my life, I believed I knew my sister better than anyone else in this world. Her name was Margaret. She was 3 years older than me, and from the time we were children, she was the person I trusted most. We grew up in a small town in western Pennsylvania, in a narrow white house with green shutters and a porch that creaked whenever anyone stepped onto it. Our father worked long hours at the steel mill, and our mother kept the house so spotless that even the kitchen towels looked afraid to wrinkle. Margaret and I shared the small bedroom at the end of the hallway. We whispered beneath the blankets after our parents went to sleep. We traded secrets, borrowed each other's clothes, and promised that no matter where life took us, we would never become strangers. For many years we kept that promise. Margaret was the brave one. She spoke her mind, traveled whenever she had the chance, and never seemed afraid of what people might think of her. I was quieter. I married young, raised 2 children, and spent most of my life trying not to cause trouble. Margaret never married. At least that was what everyone said. She worked as a librarian for more than 30 years and lived alone in a modest brick house about 15 minutes from mine. People in town thought of her as private but kind. She remembered everyone's birthday. She brought soup to sick neighbors. She sent handwritten Christmas cards even after most people had stopped sending them. But there were parts of Margaret's life that she never discussed. Whenever I asked why she had never settled down, she would smile and say that some people were simply meant to walk a different road. I accepted that answer because I loved her, and because I believed sisters were allowed to keep a few secrets from each other. I never imagined those secrets could reach beyond the grave. Margaret became ill shortly after her 69th birthday. At first, she told me it was only exhaustion. Then she said the doctors wanted to run a few tests. By the time she finally admitted the truth, the illness had already spread too far for treatment to offer much hope. She faced it with the same quiet courage she had carried all her life. She organized her papers. She labeled family photographs. She gave away her books one box at a time. And during the final weeks, I spent nearly every day sitting beside her bed. Sometimes we talked about our childhood. Sometimes we listened to old records. Sometimes we simply held hands while the afternoon light moved slowly across the floor. One evening, about a week before she died, Margaret asked me to close the bedroom door. There was something different in her voice. Something frightened. I had almost never heard fear in my sister's voice before. She pointed toward the small wooden nightstand beside her bed. Inside the bottom drawer was an old diary bound in dark brown leather. The cover was scratched and faded. A thin strap wrapped around it, secured by a small brass lock. Margaret asked me to bring it to her. Her hands trembled as she held it. Then she placed it in mine. "Take this home with you," she said. I asked her what was inside. She looked toward the closed door as though someone might be listening from the hallway. Then she made me promise never to read it. I remember smiling because the request seemed strange and dramatic. Margaret did not smile back. She tightened her fingers around my wrist and made me repeat the promise. So I did. I promised that I would never open the diary. I promised I would never read a single page. And at the time I meant it. Margaret died 6 days later. After the funeral, I took the diary home and placed it inside a wooden box on the highest shelf of my bedroom closet. Years passed. My husband died. My children moved away. The town changed. Old stores closed, familiar houses were torn down, and people who had known Margaret slowly disappeared. But the diary remained exactly where I had left it. Sometimes, while searching for a winter blanket or an old photograph, I would see the wooden box. I wondered what Margaret had written. I wondered why she had been so afraid. But every time curiosity rose inside me, I remembered her hand gripping my wrist. I remembered her eyes. And I closed the closet door. For 18 years I kept my promise. Then, on a rainy Thursday afternoon in October, someone knocked on my front door. The man standing outside appeared to be in his early 60s. His coat was soaked. His gray hair clung to his forehead, and there was something deeply familiar about his eyes, though I was certain I had never seen him before. He asked whether I was Evelyn Carter. When I said yes, he removed an old photograph from the inside pocket of his coat. The picture showed Margaret as a young woman. She could not have been more than 25. She was standing beside a man I did not recognize, smiling in a way I had never seen her smile before. The stranger turned the photograph over. A date had been written on the back. June 14, 1968. Below it were two initials, MC and TW. Before I could ask where he had found it, the stranger looked directly at me. "My name is Daniel Walker," he said. "I believe your sister knew my father." Then he paused. "And I believe she wrote about what happened to him in her diary." The rain fell harder behind him. I stood frozen in the doorway, holding a photograph from a life my sister had never told me existed. And for the first time in 18 years, I began to wonder whether keeping my promise had been a terrible mistake. I did not invite Daniel inside immediately. My age, you become cautious. Living alone teaches you that not every unexpected visitor deserves your trust. The rain continued falling behind him, drumming softly against the porch roof while we stared at each other. He seemed nervous, not dangerous, just uncertain. As though he had rehearsed this conversation 100 times but forgotten every word the moment I opened the door. "I'm sorry to appear without warning," he said quietly. "I've been trying to find you for almost 3 months." I looked again at the photograph in my hands. Margaret looked younger than I had ever remembered her. Not simply younger, happier. Her smile reached her eyes. It wasn't the polite smile she gave neighbors or librarians or church friends. It was genuine, almost radiant. Standing beside her was a tall young man wearing a denim jacket. His arm rested gently around her shoulder, not possessively, comfortably, like someone who belonged there. I searched my memory. Nothing. I had never seen that man before in my entire life. "I think you've mistaken my sister for someone else," I finally said. Daniel slowly shook his head. "I don't believe I have." He reached carefully into his coat again. This time he removed a yellow envelope, worn thin from age. The paper looked fragile enough to crumble between his fingers. "My father kept this until the day he died." He handed it to me carefully. Written across the front, in unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "Thomas Walker." The handwriting stopped my heart. I knew every curve of those letters. Margaret had written my birthday cards every year. She labeled every family photograph. She wrote recipes for our mother. It was her handwriting. Without question, I looked back at Daniel. Who was Thomas Walker? He lowered his eyes. "My father." The words settled over us like another layer of rain. "My father died 8 months ago," Daniel continued. "While cleaning his attic, I found several boxes that had never been opened. Inside one of them was this photograph." He pointed toward Margaret's smiling face. "And more than 30 letters." I stared at him. "Letters?" He nodded. "They were all written by your sister." I felt my stomach tighten. "That isn't possible." "They stopped suddenly in late 1969. His voice became softer. "My father never explained why." I stepped back without realizing it. The porch suddenly felt too small, too crowded. Margaret had written letters to a man none of us had ever heard about. Dozens of them. For years. How could an entire relationship disappear without anyone in our family noticing? I think. Daniel hesitated. I think whatever happened between them changed both of their lives. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I opened the screen door. You'd better come inside. He removed his wet coat carefully before stepping into my living room. The scent of rain followed him. I offered him a towel and pointed toward the old rocking chair near the fireplace. The room felt strangely unfamiliar, as though my own house had become the setting for someone else's story. I made tea mostly because I needed something to do with my hands. The kettle whistled. The cups rattled slightly as I placed them on the table. Only then did I sit across from him. Daniel removed another photograph from the envelope. Then another. Then another. Each one showed Margaret. Different years. Different places. A lakeside picnic. A county fair. Small bookstore. Christmas gathering. Always beside the same young man. Always smiling. One photograph showed him kneeling beside an old Chevrolet while Margaret laughed so hard she had covered her face. Another captured them sitting beneath a maple tree, reading from the same book. There were no wedding photographs. No children. Nothing dramatic. Just ordinary moments. The kind of moments couples collect over years together. Except none of us had known he existed. I don't understand, I whispered. My sister never mentioned him. Daniel nodded slowly. My father never spoke about her either. Not once. He leaned forward. When I found the photographs, I thought she might have been an old friend. But then I found the letters. He opened the yellow envelope. I only read the first one. After that, he hesitated. I felt like I was reading something that belonged to someone else. I looked at him with surprise. You stopped. He smiled faintly. My father taught me that some things deserve respect. I thought maybe you should decide what happens next. Those words struck me deeply. Respect. Promise. Secrets. For 18 years, I had refused to read Margaret's diary because of respect. Daniel had refused to read the letters for exactly the same reason. Neither of us realized we were protecting pieces of the same story. He reached into the envelope and removed one folded sheet. I did bring this. It wasn't inside the letters. It was underneath them. The paper was newer, cream-colored. Across the top was written, "If anyone ever finds these letters." There was no signature. Daniel unfolded it carefully. I'll read it if that's all right. I simply nodded. His voice remained calm. If these letters are ever discovered after my death, I ask only one thing. Please find Margaret Carter before anyone else does. She deserves to know the truth. I never stopped loving her. I only stopped believing she could forgive me. Daniel stopped reading. Silence filled the room. I felt tears gathering before I even realized I was crying. Not because I understood, but because I didn't. Everything I believed about my sister's life was beginning to unravel. The quiet librarian. The woman who never married. The sister who had lived alone. What if none of that had been the complete story? What if Margaret had spent decades carrying a grief she never allowed anyone to see? I suddenly remembered something from long ago. One summer afternoon. I must have been 15. Margaret was 18. She had come home later than usual. Mother had asked where she had been. Margaret answered simply, "With friends." But after dinner I saw her sitting alone on the back porch. She wasn't crying. She was smiling while holding a folded piece of paper. When she noticed me watching, she quickly tucked it into her sweater. I never asked about it. Back then, sisters respected each other's privacy. No. 60 years later. I wondered if that folded paper had been one of Thomas Walker's letters. Daniel gently slid the photographs back into the envelope. I don't want to pressure you, but I think your sister left answers somewhere. His eyes met mine. And I think they're inside that diary. After Daniel left that evening, my house felt different. Not quieter. Heavier. The kind of silence that settles over a place after someone has said something that cannot be taken back. I locked the front door, turned off the porch light, and stood in the hallway for several minutes without moving. The old grandfather clock ticked steadily in the living room. Every swing of its pendulum seemed louder than usual. I looked toward the staircase. At the top, behind the bedroom door, inside the closet, rested the small wooden box I had not opened in 18 years. The diary was still there, exactly where Margaret had asked me to leave it. For the first time since her funeral, I found myself walking upstairs with no intention of finding blankets or old photographs. I was walking toward the promise. Halfway up the stairs I stopped. My hand rested on the wooden railing. I could almost hear Margaret's voice. Promise me. It had never sounded like a simple request. Had sounded like protection. Protection from what? That was the question I had never allowed myself to ask. I entered my bedroom slowly. The room looked exactly as it always had. A neatly made bed. White curtains moving gently with the evening breeze. Family photographs covering the dresser. One picture caught my attention. Margaret and I stood together outside our parents' house. She was wearing a pale blue dress. I was laughing because she had whispered something just before the picture was taken. Looking at it now, I noticed something I had never paid attention to before. She wore a small silver necklace. A simple heart-shaped pendant. I had completely forgotten about it. She wore it almost every day when we were young. Then, one year it simply disappeared. I never asked what had happened to it. There were so many little things I had never asked. I opened the closet. The wooden box sat exactly where I had left it. Dust covered the lid. Carefully I carried it to the bed. The brass latch still worked perfectly. Inside lay the diary. Dark brown leather. Scratches across the cover. Tiny brass lock. The leather had aged beautifully. It smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. My fingers rested on the cover. I could open it. No one would ever know. Except me. Except Margaret. Closed my eyes. No. I whispered the word aloud. I made a promise. Slowly I placed the diary back inside the box. The relief lasted only a few seconds. Then another thought entered my mind. Daniel had never asked me to break my promise. He had only told me what his father had written. Please find Margaret before anyone else does. What if someone else came looking? What if those letters were only part of a much larger story? I barely slept that night. Every hour I woke and looked toward the bedroom closet. By morning I had made a decision. If I refused to read the diary, perhaps I could still learn the truth another way. Margaret's house. After her death, the property had been sold. The new owners had lived there for years. But not everything had gone with the sale. When we cleaned the house after the funeral, there had been several boxes of personal belongings that no one wanted. I had stored them in my garage. Old kitchen utensils, family recipes, Christmas decorations, photo albums, school notebooks. I had not looked through them in nearly 2 decades. After breakfast, I opened the garage. The smell of old cardboard and engine oil greeted me immediately. Along the back wall stood 6 dusty boxes labeled in black marker. Margaret. I smiled sadly. Even after 18 years, seeing her name written there hurt more than I expected. One by one, I carried the boxes into the kitchen. Most contained ordinary things. Old sweaters, greeting cards, receipts, church bulletins. Nothing unusual. The second box held dozens of family photographs. I spent nearly an hour looking through them. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, summer picnics. Then I noticed something curious. There were almost no photographs of Margaret between the ages of 23 and 28. Plenty before, plenty after. But those 5 years, almost nothing. It was as though someone had removed an entire chapter from her life. The third box contained books. Inside one of them, an old copy of Jane Eyre. Something slipped onto the table. Train ticket. Pennsylvania Railroad. September 1968. Destination Pittsburgh. Margaret had never mentioned traveling there. I turned the ticket over. Nothing. No notes. No explanation. Only a faded date. I placed it beside the photographs. The fourth box proved even stranger. At the bottom, wrapped inside yellow tissue paper, lay a small wooden jewelry case. I recognized it immediately. Mother had given it to Margaret on her 21st birthday. Inside were several inexpensive earrings, pearl brooch, an old wristwatch that no longer worked. But the silver heart-shaped necklace from the photograph was missing. Only the empty indentation remained in the velvet lining. I stared at it for several seconds. Had Margaret kept wearing it until the day she died? Or had she given it to someone? Someone like Thomas Walker? The thought refused to leave me. As the afternoon wore on, the kitchen table became covered with pieces of a life I suddenly realized I had never truly understood. Photographs, letters from cousins, old recipes, birthday cards, train tickets, receipts. Nothing connected. Nothing explained anything. Yet together they suggested there had been another Margaret. One who existed beyond the sister I thought I knew. Just as I began packing everything away, something slid from the bottom flap of the final cardboard box. It landed face down on the floor. I bent carefully and picked it up. It was another photograph. This one had clearly been hidden. The edges were worn from being folded. Margaret stood beside Thomas once again. But this photograph was different. He wasn't simply standing beside her. He was holding her hand. Both of them were smiling directly into the camera. Behind them stood a small white chapel. Someone had written across the back in faded blue ink, "The happiest day of my life." No date. No signature. Just those 6 words. I felt my heart pounding. Had they been engaged? Married? Neither possibility made sense. Our parents would have known, wouldn't they? As I continued studying the picture, I noticed something so small I almost missed it. On Margaret's left hand, there appeared to be a ring. Not large, not flashy, a simple gold band. I sank slowly into the kitchen chair. My sister, the woman everyone believed had never married, was wearing what looked very much like a wedding ring. That exact moment the telephone rang. The sudden sound startled me so badly the photograph slipped from my hands. I answered on the second ring. "Evelyn." It was Daniel. His voice sounded tense. "I'm sorry to bother you again. What is it?" He hesitated. "I think someone has already started looking for the diary." Every muscle in my body tightened. "What do you mean?" "There was someone outside my father's old house this morning. He asked questions about Margaret. And when I told him I didn't know anything," Daniel took a slow breath. "He asked one question before leaving." I gripped the telephone harder. "What did he ask?" Daniel's voice dropped almost to a whisper. "He asked if I knew where your sister kept her diary." For several seconds I couldn't answer. I simply held the telephone against my ear while Daniel's words echoed through my mind. Someone was looking for the diary. Not the letters. Not the photographs. The diary. That meant whoever this stranger was already knew it existed. How? Only 3 people had ever known about it. Margaret, me, and now Daniel. Unless there had once been a 4th person. "Daniel," I finally said. "Did the man tell you his name?" "No." "What did he look like?" "He was probably in his late 60s. Gray hair. Very well dressed." He spoke calmly. Daniel paused. But there was something strange. "What?" "He never asked whether my father had written a diary. He only cared about Margaret's." That detail sent a chill through me. The stranger hadn't come searching for family memories. He had come searching for something specific. Something he believed Margaret had written. "When did he leave?" "Yes. About an hour ago." "And you don't know where he went?" "No. I almost called the police. But he never threatened me. He simply thanked me for my time and drove away." "What kind of car?" "A dark blue sedan. No license plate I could remember." I walked slowly toward the kitchen window. Outside, the neighborhood looked peaceful. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalk. A woman walked her golden retriever across the street. Nothing appeared unusual. Yet suddenly, I felt as though someone might be watching my house. "I think you should be careful," Daniel said. "So should you." I don't even know why. Neither do I. But my father wasn't the kind of man who frightened easily. Near the end of his life, he told me something I've never forgotten. "Waited," he said. Daniel's voice softened. "Some promises protect people. Others protect the truth." After we ended the call, I locked every door in the house. Then I checked every window. I even closed the curtains, something I almost never did during the afternoon. It felt ridiculous. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that my quiet life had suddenly become connected to something much larger than I understood. The photograph still rested on the kitchen table. Margaret, Thomas, the chapel, the ring. Picked it up once more. This time I examined every tiny detail. The chapel wasn't familiar. It wasn't from our hometown. The trees looked different. The hills behind them seemed steeper than those near where we had grown up. Then I noticed something almost invisible. Above the chapel entrance hung a wooden sign. The photograph was blurry, but with enough light I could make out part of the lettering. Saint. Only that. Nothing more. A church beginning with Saint. Thousands of churches had names like that. Still, it was my first real clue. I placed the photograph beside the train ticket from 1968. Pittsburgh. Perhaps the chapel had been there. Perhaps Thomas had lived there. The more I thought about it, the more impossible it became to sit still. I needed answers. Not because curiosity had finally defeated my promise, but because someone else was searching for the same truth. Late that afternoon I drove to the public library. Not because I expected to find the diary, but because Margaret had spent 34 years working there. If anyone remembered her younger days, it would be the people who had known her before I realized there had been secrets. The library had changed very little. The same brick entrance. The same oak shelves. Even the smell was familiar. Paper. Wood polish. Old books. Behind the front desk stood a woman I recognized immediately. Helen Brooks. She had worked alongside Margaret for years. She looked up from her computer and smiled. "Evelyn. What a wonderful surprise." We hugged gently. After a few minutes of ordinary conversation, I asked the question that had been growing inside me all day. "Helen, can I ask you something about Margaret?" Her smile softened. "Of course. Did she ever mention someone named Thomas Walker?" Helen's expression changed so quickly that she didn't have time to hide it. Only for a second. But I saw it. Recognition. She knew the name. She looked toward the reading room before answering. "I haven't heard that name in decades." So she did know him. Helen sighed. "I wasn't sure anyone else remembered." My pulse quickened. "What can you tell me?" She hesitated. "I probably shouldn't. Please. It may be important." She studied my face for several long seconds. Then she nodded. "Come with me." She led me into a small staff room at the back of the library. Once the door closed, she spoke quietly. "Margaret wasn't always the quiet librarian everyone remembers." "I know. No." Helen smiled sadly. "I don't think you do. She used to laugh all the time. She talked about traveling. She wanted to see Europe. She even spoke about opening a bookstore one day." I listened without interrupting. Then she met Thomas. My heart skipped. They were together for several years. Everyone assumed they would marry. They looked. Helen searched for the right word. Unbreakable. What happened? I never knew. One day Margaret came to work crying. The next week, she stopped talking about him. Within a month, every photograph disappeared from her desk. Every conversation ended. As if he had never existed. Did you ask her why? Many times. And she always answered the same way. Helen looked directly into my eyes. Some stories hurt innocent people. The exact words Margaret had spoken. Not once, but often enough that Helen still remembered them 60 years later. I felt my throat tighten. Innocent people. Helen nodded. I always believed she was protecting someone, not herself. Before I could ask another question, Helen stood and walked toward an old filing cabinet. She unlocked the bottom drawer. From inside, she removed a thin envelope. I almost threw this away after Margaret retired. She handed it to me. Inside was a faded newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Local couple cancels wedding days before ceremony." There was no photograph, only a short article. The names had been partially cut away. But one line remained perfectly visible. "The ceremony at St. Matthew's Chapel has been cancelled." St. Matthew's. The chapel from the photograph. My hands began trembling. Just then, something fell from inside the envelope onto the floor. Helen bent to pick it up before I could. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she slowly handed it to me. It was an old church bulletin. Folded inside was a pressed white rose, completely dried, and wrapped around its stem was a thin strand of silver chain. Without needing to see the pendant, I already knew exactly which necklace it belonged to. I stared at the silver chain in complete disbelief. The tiny links had darkened with age, but I recognized them instantly. It was Margaret's necklace. The one with the small heart-shaped pendant she had worn almost every day throughout her 20s. The pendant itself was gone. Only the broken chain remained. "Where did you get this?" I asked. Helen looked almost embarrassed. "I found it inside one of Margaret's old desk drawers after she retired. She must have forgotten it. But when I opened the drawer, this was wrapped inside the church bulletin. I never understood why." I carefully held the chain in my palm. The break wasn't caused by rust. It looked as though someone had pulled it hard enough for the clasp to snap, almost violently. "I always meant to give it back to her," Helen continued. "But every time I thought about it," she smiled sadly, "it never felt like the right moment." I folded the chain carefully back into the bulletin. "May I keep these?" Helen nodded. "I think Margaret would have wanted you to." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question that had been forming ever since I entered the library. "Helen, did Margaret ever tell you why the wedding was cancelled?" Helen slowly shook her head. "No. But I remember the day after it happened." "What do you remember?" "She came to work looking exhausted. She hadn't slept. I tried to comfort her." Helen looked toward the window as though replaying a memory from decades earlier. "She only said one sentence." "What was it?" "Sometimes loving someone means disappearing from their life." The word struck me like a physical blow. Disappearing. Not leaving. Not breaking up. Disappearing. Those weren't the words of someone angry. They were the words of someone making a sacrifice. On my drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about that sentence. Everything I had learned during the past 24 hours pointed toward the same conclusion. Margaret hadn't simply lost Thomas. She had chosen to leave him. But why? By the time I reached my house, dusk had begun settling over the neighborhood. I carried the envelope, the church bulletin, the newspaper clipping, and the broken chain inside. The diary still waited upstairs. Untouched. Silent. As though it already knew I was circling around the truth. I spread everything across my dining room table. The train ticket. The hidden photograph. The newspaper article. The silver chain. The pressed white rose. Each object seemed insignificant by itself. Together, they told the story of a life my sister had hidden from everyone. I reached for a notebook and began writing every clue in order. 1968. Train ticket to Pittsburgh. Photographs with Thomas. St. Matthew's Chapel. Cancelled wedding. Broken necklace. Then one sentence caught my attention. The newspaper article mentioned that the ceremony had been cancelled only 3 days before the wedding. 3 days. That wasn't enough time for a relationship to slowly fall apart. Something sudden had happened. Something unexpected. The telephone rang again. This time it was my daughter, Susan. We spoke every Sunday, but today was only Thursday. Mom, you sound tired. I'm all right. Are you sure? I almost told her everything. Almost. Instead, I simply said I had been organizing Margaret's old belongings. Susan laughed softly. I've been telling you to clean that garage for years. So have I. After a few minutes, she changed the subject. I'm thinking of coming next weekend. I'd like that. We'll go through some old family albums together. Family albums. The words lingered after we hung up. There was one album I hadn't checked. Not because I had forgotten it. Because I had never been able to bring myself to open it after Margaret died. It contained photographs from our parents' house before it was sold. I knew exactly where it was. Top shelf. Hallway closet. Unlike the diary, opening the album wouldn't break any promise. A few minutes later, I found it beneath a stack of old blankets. The leather cover had faded badly. Several pages had begun separating from the binding. Slowly I turned the pages. Childhood birthdays. Christmas mornings. School graduations. Then I reached the photographs from 1968. My breath caught. There was Margaret standing beside our parents on Mother's birthday. She smiled politely. But now I noticed something I had never seen before. The silver heart necklace was missing. That photograph had been taken in May. The hidden photograph with Thomas at St. Matthew's Chapel had clearly been taken in June. In June she was wearing the necklace again. Then, after the cancelled wedding, it disappeared forever. I continued turning pages. Near the end of the album, an envelope had been tucked between two sheets of protective paper. It wasn't sealed. Inside was a single photograph, one I had never seen before. It showed our entire family gathered around the dining room table. Mother, father, Margaret, me. But someone had carefully cut another person out of the picture. The edges were unmistakable. There had once been someone standing beside Margaret. Someone our family had deliberately removed. I stared at the empty space. Not accidentally damaged. Not faded. Cut out with scissors. Whoever had done it wanted that person erased. Suddenly I remembered something from my childhood. One afternoon, when I was perhaps 11 years old, I had asked Mother why one family album looked thinner than the others. She had answered immediately. Some pictures are better forgotten. At the time I thought nothing of it. No, those words sounded very different. I examined the photograph again under the kitchen light. Near the edge where the missing person had been cut away, part of a sleeve remained. Blue denim. Exactly like the jacket Thomas wore in the hidden photographs Daniel had shown me. My pulse quickened. Had my own parents removed him from every family picture? So, they hadn't merely disapproved of him. They had tried to erase him from our history. Just then I heard something outside. Car door closing. Slowly, I walked toward the living room window without turning on the lights. Across the street sat a dark blue sedan. Its headlights were off. The engine wasn't running. Someone remained inside, watching my house. I couldn't see the driver's face. But after nearly a minute, the car started, pulled away, and disappeared around the corner. Only then did I realize my hands were shaking. Someone knew. Someone believed I had Margaret's diary. And whoever they were, they had just found my home. I stood behind the living room curtain for several more minutes, watching the empty street. The blue sedan was gone. Yet I couldn't convince myself that I had imagined it. Perhaps it belonged to a neighbor. Perhaps someone had simply pulled over to answer a phone call. But after Daniel's warning, coincidence no longer felt like coincidence. I checked every lock in the house once again before making myself a cup of chamomile tea. It did little to calm me. My thoughts kept returning to the same question. Who would spend decades searching for an old woman's diary? Not money. Not jewelry. Not property. Diary. That meant whatever Margaret had written still mattered. Even after all these years. I carried my tea upstairs and paused outside the bedroom closet. The wooden box waited exactly where I had left it. For the first time in 18 years, I lifted the diary into my hands without immediately putting it back. It felt heavier than I remembered. Not physically, emotionally. As though every page carried a burden my sister had refused to place on anyone else's shoulders. My fingers rested on the brass clasp. One movement. That was all it would take. One movement. And the promise would be broken forever. Instead, I gently kissed the cover. "I'm trying, Margaret," I whispered. "I'm trying to understand without betraying you." I returned it to the box once again. The next morning, I decided to visit the only person still alive who had known both Margaret and our parents better than almost anyone. My Aunt Louise. She was 93 now and lived in a small assisted living community 20 miles away. Her memory came and went. Some days she remembered childhood stories with astonishing detail. Other days she struggled to remember what she had eaten for breakfast. If anyone knew why Thomas Walker had disappeared from our family's history, might be her. When I arrived, Aunt Louise sat near a window, knitting a blue blanket. Her hands moved more slowly than they once had, but her smile was exactly the same. "Evelyn," she reached for my hand. "You've got your mother's eyes." People had been telling me that for 60 years. I kissed her forehead and sat beside her. We spent nearly half an hour talking about ordinary things. The weather, my grandchildren, the flowers outside her window. Only after she seemed completely comfortable did I mention Margaret. Her smile softened immediately. "I still miss her." "So do I. I've been looking through some old family photographs," I said carefully. "And I found someone I didn't recognize." She looked curious. I removed the hidden photograph from my purse and placed it gently on the table between us. Her eyes widened. For a long moment she simply stared. Then she sighed. "So, you finally found him. You knew Thomas." "I met him twice. Maybe 3 times." My heart began beating faster. "Why did nobody ever tell me?" She looked away. "Because your father didn't allow anyone to." The answer stunned me. "My father?" Louise nodded slowly. "He was a proud man. He believed reputation mattered more than happiness." I frowned. "I don't understand." She remained silent for several moments. Then she asked a question I wasn't expecting. "Do you remember your father's business partner?" I searched my memory. "Mr. Henderson." "Yes. What about him?" Louise folded her knitting carefully into her lap. "Thomas worked for the Henderson family." Everything suddenly seemed connected without making any sense. So. She hesitated. "There was a disagreement." "What kind of disagreement?" "I never knew the whole story. But I remember your father coming home furious one evening. He said Margaret would never marry that boy." "Never." Felt a chill. "Did Thomas do something wrong?" Louise looked directly into my eyes. "I don't think so." "Then why?" She sighed. "Because your father believed someone else had." Waited. "He thought Thomas's father had ruined his business." The room fell silent. I remembered hearing adults whisper about financial problems when I was very young. Father had lost a great deal of money during the late 1960s. I had always assumed it was simply bad luck. No, I wasn't so sure. Did Thomas know any of this? I believe he did. And Margaret? Louise smiled sadly. She loved him anyway. Those 4 words carried more weight than any long explanation. Love anyway. Love despite family. Love despite pride. Love despite consequences. Aunt Louise. Did Margaret ever tell you why the wedding was cancelled? Louise's knitting stopped. For nearly a minute she didn't answer. Then she quietly said something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't cancelled. I stared at her. What? The wedding happened. I felt as though I had misheard. But the newspaper. The newspaper lied. My voice barely worked. What do you mean the wedding happened? Louise looked around the room to make sure nobody was listening. Then she leaned closer. I wasn't supposed to tell anyone. I promised Margaret. My heart sank. Another promise. Another secret. They were married. The words echoed inside my head. They exchanged vows. They signed the register. They left the chapel as husband and wife. Could barely breathe. But, if they were married, why did they spend the rest of their lives apart? Louise's eyes filled with tears. Because before sunset, someone came looking for them. Every hair on my arms stood up. Who? She slowly shook her head. I don't know. I only know Margaret arrived at my apartment that night. She was still wearing her wedding dress. And she kept saying the same sentence over and over. What sentence? Louise closed her eyes, repeating words she had clearly carried for decades. If he stays with me, he'll lose everything. I felt a lump rise in my throat. Margaret hadn't left Thomas because she stopped loving him. She had left because she believed staying would destroy his life. Suddenly, the broken necklace, the hidden photographs, the erased family pictures, everything pointed toward one terrible truth. My sister hadn't abandoned her marriage. She had sacrificed it. As I helped Aunt Louise back toward her room, she gently squeezed my hand. There was one more thing. What? The morning after the wedding, Margaret gave me an envelope. What was inside? I never opened it. She told me to destroy it if anything ever happened to her. My heart skipped. Did you? Louise looked embarrassed. I couldn't. I hid it instead. I stopped walking. You still have it? She nodded. I think so. It's somewhere among my old things. Then she looked at me with surprising clarity. If nobody else found it first. When I left the assisted living center that afternoon, I no longer felt like I was investigating a forgotten love story. I felt as though I had stumbled into a secret that someone had spent 60 years trying to bury. Margaret had married Thomas. Not planned to marry him. Not hoped to marry him. She had become his wife. Yet somehow, before the sun had set on their wedding day, they had disappeared from each other's lives forever. Nothing about that made sense. And now there was another mystery. The envelope Aunt Louise had hidden all those years ago. If it still existed, it might answer questions the diary never could. Or perhaps it would create even more. Before leaving, I spoke with the residence manager. She explained that Aunt Louise's belongings had never been fully organized after her last room change. Several boxes remained in a small storage room downstairs. With Louise's permission, I was allowed to look through them. The storage room smelled of dust and cedar wood. Metal shelves lined the walls. Every resident had 2 or 3 neatly labeled boxes. I quickly found 3 marked with Louise's name. The first contained old knitting supplies. The second was filled with Christmas decorations and faded greeting cards. The third was much heavier. Inside were dozens of family photographs, recipe books, old magazines, and several sealed envelopes tied together with blue ribbon. Carefully, I untied the ribbon. Most were letters from cousins and old friends. Nothing unusual. Then I noticed one envelope that looked completely different. Had no stamp, no address, no return name. Only 3 handwritten words. For Louise only. My heart began racing. The handwriting belonged to Margaret. I showed it to Aunt Louise. She looked at it for a long moment before slowly nodding. That's the one. You never opened it. Never. You can. She smiled gently. It was never really meant for me. I held the envelope carefully. The paper had yellowed with age. The seal remained untouched. For several seconds I simply stared at it. Then I remembered. Another promise. Margaret had trusted Louise. Louise had honored that trust for almost 60 years. Could I really be the one to break it? I looked back at my aunt. What would Margaret want? Louise answered without hesitation. She would want the truth to help someone. Those words settled something inside me. Slowly I opened the envelope. Inside was only one folded sheet of paper. No photographs, no documents, just a single handwritten letter. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. Again. Dear Louise, if you are reading this, then something has happened that I hoped would never happen. Please don't look for me. Please don't look for Thomas. If we are apart, it is because I chose it. I swallowed hard and continued reading. He will believe I abandoned him. That is kinder than letting him know the truth. The truth. Again. Always the truth. Yet never explained. Further down the page, another sentence caught my attention. There are people who believe something was taken from them. If they discover where Thomas is, they will destroy everything he has left. Destroy everything. Not hurt him. Not embarrass him. Destroy everything. I looked up. Aunt Louise. Did Margaret ever tell you who she meant? She slowly shook her head. No. She only cried. I had never seen her cry before. I returned to the letter. Near the bottom, Margaret had written something that made my chest tighten. One day Evelyn may ask questions. If she does, tell her I never stopped loving him. Tears blurred the words. Even after all these years, she had been thinking about me. Thinking that one day I might finally discover what happened. At the very bottom of the page was a sentence written separately from the rest. Almost as if she had added it at the last moment. Burn this after reading. Louise laughed softly through her tears. I suppose I failed. No. I folded the letter carefully. I think you succeeded. On the drive home, I couldn't stop replaying one sentence. There are people who believe something was taken from them. What had been taken? Money, property, a business, or something else entirely. Nothing fit together. Yet every answer created another question. When I arrived home, something immediately caught my attention. My mailbox stood open. That wasn't unusual. I distinctly remembered closing it before leaving that morning. I walked toward it slowly. Inside was a single white envelope. No stamp. No address. Only my name. Evelyn. Typed in black letters. A cold sensation spread through my body. I looked around the street. Everything appeared normal. The neighborhood was quiet. No unfamiliar cars. No pedestrians watching. Still, I carried the envelope inside before opening it. There was no letter. Only a single photograph. Black and white. Recently copied from an older original. It showed St. Matthew's Chapel. Me. No bride. No groom. No guest. Someone had circled one of the side windows with a red marker. On the back of the photograph were 6 typed words. You are asking dangerous questions. I stared at the message for several seconds. There was no signature. No explanation. Nothing else. Someone knew I had visited Aunt Louise. Someone knew I was searching for answers. Somehow, they had managed to place a warning inside my mailbox before I returned home. I slowly looked toward the staircase. The diary remained upstairs. Hidden. Untouched. For 18 years, it had rested quietly inside my closet. But now, for the first time, I wasn't afraid of opening it. I was afraid someone else might get to it first. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I moved the diary. Not to read it. To protect it. I wrapped it in an old wool blanket, placed it inside a plain cardboard box, and carried it down to the basement. Behind an old bookshelf, there was a narrow storage space where my late husband used to keep his fishing equipment. No one would think to look there. At least that was what I told myself. As I covered the box with a faded tarp, I couldn't ignore the irony. For 18 years, I had protected the diary because of a promise. Now I was protecting it because someone else wanted it. Those were 2 very different reasons. Sleep never came easily that night. Every small sound seemed louder than usual. The refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Branches brushing against the bedroom window. The house settling with the cool evening air. Around 2 o'clock in the morning I woke suddenly. At first I didn't know why. Then I heard it. Car. Moving very slowly down my street. I remained perfectly still beneath the blankets. The engine stopped. Silence. After several seconds, I slipped quietly out of bed and walked to the window without turning on any lights. The same dark blue sedan sat across the street. Its headlights were off. Its windows were too dark to see inside. No one stepped out. No one approached the house. Simply remained there, watching. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Finally the engine started again. The car disappeared into the darkness. I didn't return to bed. Instead, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table until sunrise. By morning I had made another decision. If someone was following my movements, then I couldn't continue searching alone. Called Daniel. He answered almost immediately. I was hoping you'd call. His voice sounded tired. Did something happen? Someone came back. My stomach tightened. To your father's house. Yes. This time they knocked. What did they want? I wasn't home. My neighbor spoke with them. Daniel paused. They showed her an old photograph of Margaret. Closed my eyes. They're definitely looking for her. No. They're looking for whatever she left behind. Neither of us needed to say the word. Cleary. I think we should meet, Daniel said. Somewhere public. An hour later, we met at a small family diner halfway between our towns. The place had been there for decades. Waitresses still called everyone honey. The smell of fresh pancakes filled the air. Ordinarily, it was the kind of place where nothing unusual ever happened. Today, every unfamiliar face made me uneasy. Daniel arrived carrying a worn leather briefcase. As soon as we sat down, he opened it. I brought everything. The photographs, the letters, his father's handwritten note, and something I had never seen before. Small pocket notebook, brown leather, far smaller than Margaret's diary. What is this? My father's. He carried it for years. I only looked through a few pages. Why? Because. He smiled faintly. I thought I should wait until I met you. He handed it to me. Unlike Margaret's diary, this notebook wasn't locked. I opened it carefully. Most pages contained ordinary things. Phone numbers, appointments, shopping lists. Then, near the middle, I found an entry dated July 3, 1968. Only 3 sentences had been written. Margaret says we must disappear. She won't explain why. I trust her. Even though it breaks my heart. I felt tears gathering again. Thomas hadn't left because he wanted to. He had trusted her. Just as I had trusted Margaret all these years. Daniel turned another page. This one. The next entry had been written almost 2 weeks later. The handwriting looked shakier. She sent the ring back. No note. No explanation. Only the necklace. Froze. The necklace. Daniel nodded. My father kept both. The ring disappeared after he died. But the necklace. He reached inside the briefcase. Carefully, he removed a small velvet pouch. My breath caught. Inside rested a silver heart-shaped pendant. Exactly the one missing from the broken chain Helen had given me. The chain had stayed with Margaret. The pendant had remained with Thomas. For 60 years. Separated. Just like they had been. Neither of us spoke. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Daniel gently placed the pendant beside the broken chain I had brought from the library. Without saying a word, we connected them. The clasp no longer worked. The chain was too damaged. But together, they became whole again. Neither of us noticed the elderly waitress standing beside the table until she quietly said, "That's a beautiful necklace." We both looked up. She smiled politely. My husband gave me one almost exactly like it back in 1965. Then her expression changed. She leaned a little closer. I hope you don't mind me asking. Where did you find that pendant? Daniel answered politely. It belonged to my father. The waitress frowned. I've seen it before. Both of us stared at her. You have. She nodded slowly. Years ago. Very long ago. I worked at St. Matthew's Chapel before I came here. Every muscle in my body tensed. St. Matthew's. Again. I remember that pendant because. She hesitated. There was a young bride wearing it. Daniel and I exchanged a stunned look. The wedding? Yes. The waitress nodded. Yes. I remember her crying before the ceremony. And afterward? What happened afterward? Her smile disappeared. 3 men arrived. The coffee cup slipped slightly in my hands. They were arguing with the groom outside. What men? I never learned their names. But I remember one thing. What? They weren't looking for the bride. They wanted something the groom supposedly had. Daniel leaned forward. What did they think he had? The waitress slowly shook her head. I never found out. But I heard one of them shout. She closed her eyes, trying to remember. Then repeated the words exactly as she had heard them nearly 60 years earlier. If he won't give it back, we'll make sure nobody ever finds it. Neither Daniel nor I spoke for several moments. The waitress looked from one of us to the other, as if she suddenly realized her memory meant far more to us than it did to her. I'm sorry, she said softly. I didn't mean to interrupt. You didn't interrupt, I replied quickly. You may have just answered a question we've been asking for days. She smiled politely before returning to the kitchen. Daniel and I remained frozen. 3 men had confronted Thomas immediately after the wedding. Not because of Margaret. Not because they opposed the marriage. They wanted something. Something they believed Thomas possessed. And according to the words Margaret had written years later, those same people believed something had been taken from them. The pieces were finally beginning to fit together. But they still formed an incomplete picture. Daniel reached into his briefcase again. I almost forgot. There was one more thing inside my father's notebook. He carefully removed a folded piece of paper. Unlike everything else, this paper looked newer. It had clearly been folded and unfolded many times. Across the top, in Thomas's handwriting, were 4 simple words. Things I must remember. It wasn't a diary entry. It was a list. Number 1. Never tell anyone about the package. Number 2. Never write the real names. Number 3. Protect Margaret even if she hates me. 4. The writing stopped halfway across the page. The sentence had never been finished. As though someone had interrupted him. I looked at Daniel. Did your father ever mention a package? Never. What about your mother? He smiled sadly. My father never married. That surprised me. I assumed. So did everyone. He looked down at his coffee. My mother and father were never together. He raised me alone. The realization hit me immediately. Thomas had never replaced Margaret. Just as Margaret had never replaced Thomas. For 6 decades, both had lived alone, still carrying the memory of a marriage that had lasted less than a single day. Daniel looked out the diner window. I used to think my father preferred being alone. Now, I think he was simply waiting for someone who never came back. Neither of us noticed how quiet the restaurant had become. The breakfast rush had ended. Only 4 customers remained. One elderly couple, a truck driver reading the newspaper, and a man sitting alone near the front window. He wore a dark gray jacket and a baseball cap. Nothing unusual. He wasn't eating. His untouched coffee had gone cold. And every few minutes, he looked toward our table. Daniel noticed him too. Has he been there long? I turned casually. I don't know. The man lowered his eyes immediately. Perhaps we were imagining things. After everything that had happened, it had become easy to suspect strangers. Something about him unsettled me. We decided to leave. Daniel paid the bill while I carefully placed every photograph and document back inside my purse. As we stepped outside, the gray-jacketed man exited the diner only seconds after us. He walked toward the parking lot. Not quickly, not slowly, just enough to remain nearby. Daniel noticed it too. Without speaking, we both continued toward our cars. I unlocked mine. He unlocked his. The man stopped beside a dark blue sedan. The same model I had seen outside my house. My heart began pounding. Before either of us could react, the man climbed inside. He didn't drive away immediately. He lowered his window, looked directly at me, and spoke in a calm, almost friendly voice. "You should stop looking." That was all. No threat. No anger. Just those 4 words. Then he drove away. Daniel hurried toward me. "Did you know him?" "No. But I think he knows us." Neither of us felt comfortable going home immediately. Instead, we drove to a nearby public park and sat on a bench overlooking a small lake. For nearly an hour, we discussed every clue. The wedding, the missing photographs, the necklace, the mysterious package, the strangers. Finally, Daniel asked the question neither of us had wanted to say aloud. What if the diary isn't about Margaret and Thomas at all? I frowned. What do you mean? What if? He searched for the right words. What if the diary explains what those men were looking for? The thought struck me immediately. Course. Perhaps the love story had only been the surface. The real secret might have been something entirely different. Something dangerous enough to destroy 2 lives. I reached into my purse and removed Margaret's letter to Aunt Louise. Again, one sentence caught my attention. There are people who believe something was taken from them. Not stolen. Taken. The distinction mattered. Someone can steal money. But ideas, documents, evidence, those are taken. Daniel suddenly looked thoughtful. My father worked as an accountant for the Henderson family. I looked up. You never told me that. I didn't think it mattered. It does now. He nodded slowly. If there was a package, and if people believed my father had it, it might not have belonged to him. My mind raced. Could Thomas have discovered something? Financial records, proof of fraud, something involving the Henderson business. Was that why my father had hated the Walker family? Or had he been protecting Margaret from something far more dangerous? As the afternoon sun reflected across the lake, I realized we had reached the limit of what guessing could accomplish. Every road led back to one place. The diary. It no longer represented only a promise. It had become the only witness still capable of telling the complete story. Daniel looked at me carefully. I won't ask you to break your promise. I know. But if Margaret knew someone might come searching one day, maybe. He hesitated. Maybe the promise wasn't meant to last forever. I looked across the calm water. For 18 years I had believed keeping my promise honored my sister. Now I began wondering if refusing to understand her final wish had actually dishonored everything she had sacrificed. That evening, after returning home, I walked directly to the basement. I pulled away the old tarp, lifted the cardboard box, and carried the diary upstairs once more. This time, instead of placing it back inside the closet, I set it gently on my dining room table. Then I found the tiny brass key Margaret had taped beneath the box 18 years earlier. I had completely forgotten it was there. The key rested in my trembling hand. Only one turn separated me from the truth my sister had carried for 60 years. I held the tiny brass key between my fingers for what felt like an eternity. It was smaller than I remembered. Simple. Slightly tarnished. For 18 years, it had remained taped beneath the wooden box, exactly where Margaret had hidden it. Perhaps she had expected me to forget it. Or perhaps she had hoped that one day I would remember. The diary rested quietly on the dining room table. Outside, the evening sky had turned deep blue. The neighborhood was peaceful. The only sound came from the old clock in the hallway. Each second seemed to ask the same question. Would I finally open it? I reached toward the lock, then stopped. Instead of inserting the key, I placed my hand gently on the leather cover. I'm sorry, I whispered. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. Tears filled my eyes. I only know I can't protect your secret if I don't understand it. For the first time since Margaret's funeral, I believed those words, not because curiosity had won, but because responsibility had. Slowly, I inserted the key. The lock turned with a soft metallic click. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it. I lifted the cover. The first page contained nothing except Margaret's handwriting. If this diary is being read, means one of two things. Either I have failed, or the danger has finally ended. Closed my eyes. She had known. She had known someone would eventually open it. I continued reading. Please, if you are Evelyn, know that I never wanted this burden to become yours. If you are anyone else, you already know more than you should. Stop. My pulse quickened. She had expected the diary to fall into the wrong hands. That explained everything. The warning, the strangers, the surveillance. The diary had never been hidden to preserve memories. It had been hidden to protect information. The next several pages surprised me. There was almost nothing about Thomas. Margaret carefully described ordinary days. Library work, shopping, recipes, weather. For nearly 20 pages, the diary looked completely harmless, almost boring. Then I noticed something. Certain words appeared darker than the others, as though she had pressed the pen harder. Bridge, river, block, 7, window, north. First they seemed random, until I wrote them down. They formed no sentence, no pattern. Yet Margaret had clearly intended them to stand out. Code. She had hidden something inside the diary itself. Before I could study it further, the telephone rang. The sudden sound startled me. It was Daniel. I've been thinking. So have I. I remembered something my father used to say. What? He always repeated one sentence whenever I asked about the past. Daniel paused. Never trust the first page. I looked down at the diary. What? He said important people sometimes hide the truth where everyone expects to find it. What are you reading now? I explained the strange highlighted words. There was silence. Then Daniel laughed softly. My father loved crossword puzzles. So did Margaret. Another pause. What if the diary isn't meant to be read? What if it's meant to be solved? That possibility had never occurred to me. Perhaps Margaret knew someone would eventually force the diary open. So, she would never place the truth on the first pages. She would hide it. Somewhere only someone patient enough could discover it. After hanging up, I continued turning pages. More ordinary entries. More carefully emphasized words. Ill. Lantern. Third. Tone. Again they made no sense. Until one folded sheet slipped from between 2 pages and landed softly on the table. It wasn't part of the diary. It had been tucked inside years earlier. The paper was different, thicker. On the outside, Margaret had written only one sentence. Read this only after opening the diary. With trembling hands, I unfolded it. Dear Evelyn, if you are reading this, then I know exactly how frightened you must feel. Please believe me when I say this. The diary is not the secret. The diary only points toward it. I felt every muscle tighten. She continued. Everything that truly matters is somewhere else. If anyone tries to take this diary, let them. They will leave disappointed. I stared at the words in disbelief. For 18 years, I had protected the wrong thing. The diary had been a decoy map, not the destination. Further down the page, Margaret had written something that made my breath catch. Thomas never betrayed anyone. Neither did I. We simply refused to hand over something that never belonged to those men. Something. Always something. Never explained. Near the bottom appeared another instruction. Find the place where we said goodbye. Everything begins there. I whispered the sentence aloud. The place where we said goodbye. But where? The chapel. The train station. A park. A bridge. Margaret assumed I would understand. Yet I didn't. I turned the paper over. Nothing. No map. No address. Only a tiny drawing in one corner. A single oak leaf. Perfectly detailed. The word she had emphasized earlier. Suddenly I remembered. Bridge. River. Third. Tone. Window. Those weren't random words. They were directions. Or clues. Just as I reached for my notebook to write them all together, someone knocked on my front door. 3 slow knocks. Not loud. Not impatient. Almost polite. I looked at the clock. 9:47 p.m. Nobody visited me at that hour. The knocking came again. Exactly 3 times. I quietly folded Margaret's letter and slipped it inside my sweater. Then I turned off the dining room light. From the darkness of the hallway, I looked through the small window beside the door. An elderly man stood alone on my porch. He held nothing in his hands. He wasn't wearing a hat. His silver hair moved gently in the evening breeze. When he realized I was watching, he smiled. Not warmly, not cruelly, sadly. Then he spoke clearly enough for me to hear through the glass. "I knew your sister." My heart froze. He waited a moment before adding one more sentence. "And she's been expecting you." For a moment I couldn't move. The elderly man remained standing on my porch with his hands folded in front of him, as though he had all the time in the world. His face wasn't familiar, at least not consciously. Yet something about him stirred a distant memory I couldn't quite reach. He wasn't trying to force his way inside. He wasn't shouting. He simply waited, patiently. I unlocked the front door but left the screen door closed between us. "Who are you?" he asked. "My name is Samuel Bennett." His voice was calm. "I was a friend of Thomas Walker." The words settled heavily between us. "You knew my sister." "I knew both of them." He glanced toward the dining room. "May I come in?" Every instinct told me to be careful, but there was something different about Samuel. Unlike the strangers who had been following us, he wasn't asking about the diary. He wasn't demanding answers. He looked tired, like a man who had carried someone else's burden for far too many years. After a long hesitation, I opened the screen door. He stepped inside slowly, removing his hat before crossing the threshold. "My mother taught me never to enter someone's home wearing a hat," he said with a faint smile. The simple gesture reminded me of another generation. I offered him a seat at the dining table. The diary lay only a few feet away. Without drawing attention to it, I quietly closed its cover. Samuel noticed. "I see you've finally opened it." My heart skipped. "You knew about the diary." "I knew Margaret intended someone to open it one day. She never told me when. Only that if the time came, it would mean she had failed to keep everyone safe." I stared at him. What exactly was she trying to protect? Samuel looked toward the window before answering. "Not herself." "I know that." "Not Thomas." "I know that too." He nodded. "She was protecting a child." Those words hit me like a wave. "A child?" He lowered his eyes. "Yes." My mind immediately raced. Thomas and Margaret never had children. At least, as far as anyone knew. Samuel must have seen the confusion on my face. It wasn't their child. I felt slightly relieved, then even more confused. Whose child? Samuel took a deep breath. I've asked myself that question for 60 years. Before I could ask another, he reached inside his coat and carefully removed a small envelope. "I've kept this since 1968. The paper looked almost as old as Margaret's diary. I promised Thomas the First would only deliver it when someone finally began asking the right questions." He slid it across the table toward me. On the front, in Thomas's handwriting, were 5 words. "Only if Evelyn understands." My throat tightened. He knew me. Samuel smiled softly. "He never met you. But he knew Margaret loved you. She spoke about you constantly." My eyes filled with tears. "So why didn't he ever come looking for us?" Samuel looked away. "Because Margaret made him promise. Another promise. Another sacrifice." "Please," I whispered. "No more pieces. Tell me everything." Samuel remained silent for nearly a full minute. Finally he spoke. "Thomas worked for the Henderson family." "I know. But he wasn't just an accountant. He handled private financial records." I nodded slowly. One evening, he discovered money disappearing from company accounts. Large amounts. He believed someone inside the company was stealing. That sounded almost ordinary. Until Samuel continued. The problem wasn't the money. It was where the money was going. I frowned. Where? Samuel answered quietly. To people who never officially existed. A cold sensation spread through my body. What does that mean? It means the records contained names that weren't real. Fake companies. False identities. Hidden payments. Thomas had uncovered something illegal. Something significant. He copied the records. Samuel nodded. Only enough to prove what he found. He planned to report everything. And that's when everything fell apart. I thought of the mysterious package. The package. Samuel looked at me. Exactly. The documents. They believed Thomas still had them. But he didn't. Who did? Samuel smiled sadly. They never figured that out. At that moment, I remembered Margaret's letter. The diary is not the secret. Course. The real evidence had never been inside the diary. Had always been somewhere else. So Margaret hid it. Samuel didn't answer. Instead, he looked directly at me. What has the diary told you? Very little. It mentioned an oak leaf. His expression changed instantly. You saw that? Yes. The words. Bridge. River. Oak. Third stone. Samuel closed his eyes. I hoped she wouldn't use that clue. Why? Because it leads to the place where they said goodbye. The place mentioned in her letter. He nodded. Yes. What is it? Samuel hesitated. The old covered bridge outside Mill Creek. The word struck something deep inside my memory. Mill Creek. I hadn't been there since childhood. There had been an enormous oak tree beside the bridge. My father used to stop there during Sunday drives. Suddenly I remembered something else. One afternoon, Margaret had insisted on getting out of the car. She walked alone toward the bridge for several minutes. When she returned, she had been crying. Mother pretended not to notice. Father drove away without saying a word. At the time, I couldn't have been older than 12. No. That forgotten afternoon suddenly carried an entirely different meaning. Samuel stood. You mustn't wait too long. Why? Because if someone else has also understood Margaret's clues, they'll be heading there too. I stood as well. Will you come with me? He slowly shook his head. My part ended long ago. He placed one gentle hand on the diary. Margaret trusted you. So did Thomas. I believe they chose correctly. As he reached the front door, I asked the question that had been haunting me since this began. Samuel, did Margaret ever regret leaving Thomas? He smiled with tears in his eyes. Every single day. Then he opened the door. Before stepping outside, he turned one last time. Oh, I almost forgot. There was one sentence Thomas asked me to tell you if this day ever came. I held my breath. Samuel repeated it exactly. If Evelyn finds the bridge, tell her not to search above it. Tell her to look beneath the third stone. Then he quietly walked into the darkness, leaving me alone with the diary, and the first real direction anyone had given me in 60 years. I barely slept that night. Not because I was afraid anymore, because I finally had somewhere to go. 4 days, every clue had pointed in a different direction. Now they all led to the same place. Mill Creek, the old covered bridge, the enormous oak tree, the third stone. At sunrise I called Daniel. He answered before the second ring. I was just about to call you. I know where we have to go. There was a brief silence. So do I, he replied. I couldn't stop thinking about the bridge. An hour later he arrived at my house. This time he brought a small backpack instead of the leather briefcase. Inside were gloves, flashlights, bottled water, and copies of every photograph we had collected. You came prepared. He smiled. My father always said that if you're searching for the truth, you should wear old shoes. Despite everything, I laughed. It was the first genuine laugh I'd had in days. The drive to Mill Creek took just over 40 minutes. Neither of us spoke much. The countryside slowly replaced neighborhoods. Cornfields stretched toward the horizon. Old barns leaned with age. Telephone poles marched beside the road like silent witnesses to another era. Eventually the asphalt narrowed. A weathered wooden sign appeared beside the road. Mill Creek Historic Bridge. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. I haven't been here since I was a little girl. Daniel looked through the windshield. It hasn't changed much. The bridge appeared exactly as I remembered. Dark wooden beams. A faded red exterior. The creek flowing gently beneath it. And beside the entrance, the great oak tree was even larger now. Its branches spread like open arms across the morning sky. For a long moment, neither of us got out of the car. We simply looked. It feels strange, Daniel said quietly. As though they were both here. I know. When we finally stepped onto the bridge, the old wooden floor creaked beneath our feet. The sound echoed softly inside the tunnel of weathered beams. Closed my eyes. For just a second, I imagined Margaret standing there, young, nervous, still wearing her wedding dress, waiting for Thomas, or perhaps saying goodbye. The thought made my chest ache. We crossed to the center of the bridge. The creek shimmered below through narrow openings between the planks. It says beneath the third stone, Daniel reminded me. Not above. We walked down the narrow path leading to the water. Years of fallen leaves covered the ground. The creek itself was shallow, no more than knee-deep in most places. Large stones lined the bank. Some were almost completely buried beneath moss. Others had shifted over the decades. Which direction? Yes. Daniel looked back toward the bridge. Maybe count from the nearest support. We began examining the stones carefully. First, second, third. The third stone was enormous, flat across the top, half buried in the soil. Daniel knelt beside it. It hasn't moved in years. Together we pushed. Nothing. We tried again. Still nothing. It may not be this one. Then I noticed something. Near one edge of the stone. Tiny mark. Not natural. Someone had carved a small heart into it. My breath caught. The necklace. Daniel looked closer. Inside the heart, barely visible, were two initials. Margaret. Thomas. This is it. We pushed again. This time the stone shifted slightly. Only an inch. But enough. Beneath it lay a narrow metal box, about the size of a hardcover book. Its surface was covered in rust. Neither of us spoke. For 60 years. It had remained hidden beneath that stone, protected by nothing more than time. Daniel carefully lifted it free. The lid resisted at first. Then, with a soft cracking sound, opened. Inside were several waterproof oilcloth packages, remarkably well preserved. One contained old photographs. Another held folded documents. Third, contained 2 sealed envelopes. One addressed to Thomas. Other, to Evelyn. My knees nearly gave way. She knew, Daniel whispered. She knew you would be the one. With trembling hands, I picked up the envelope bearing my name. The paper looked almost new thanks to the protective wrapping. I opened it slowly. Inside was another handwritten letter. Dear Evelyn, if you are holding this, then you found the place where Thomas and I said goodbye. I'm so sorry you had to carry this burden. Please forgive me. I never wanted my silence to become yours. Tears blurred the page. I continued reading. The documents in this box do not belong to me. They never did. They belong to every family who was hurt by the lies we uncovered. Thomas wanted to expose everything. I wanted him to stay alive. So I hid the evidence. And I made him promise never to look for me again. The sentence that followed stole the breath from my lungs. I wasn't trying to save our marriage. I was trying to save his life. Daniel quietly turned away, giving me privacy. Further down the page, Margaret had written, "If you are reading this after both Thomas and I are gone, then no promise remains between us. Tell the truth." Finally, I folded the letter against my chest. For 60 years, she had waited for someone to finish the story she had been unable to tell herself. Then Daniel suddenly stopped moving. "Evelyn!" "What?" He was staring at the bottom of the metal box. Hidden beneath the documents was something wrapped in white cloth. Carefully he lifted it out. When he unfolded the fabric, a simple gold wedding ring rolled gently into the palm of his hand. The same ring Thomas had written that Margaret returned. She never had. She had hidden it, alongside the truth, waiting for the day someone finally came looking. For several long seconds, neither Daniel nor I touched the ring. It rested in the center of his palm, catching the morning sunlight as though it had been waiting all these years for someone to find it again. A simple gold band. No diamonds. No engraving on the outside. Just a wedding ring that had survived beneath a stone for nearly 6 decades. Daniel finally broke the silence. "My father wrote that she sent it back." I looked at the ring. No. She wanted him to believe she had. He frowned. "Why would she do that?" I remembered Margaret's letter. "I wasn't trying to save our marriage. I was trying to save his life." She needed Thomas to believe the marriage was over. If he believed she had truly left him, he would stop looking. And if he stopped looking, whoever was following them would have no reason to keep watching him. It was cruel. But it was also the greatest act of love I had ever witnessed. Daniel slowly turned the ring over. "There is something inside." I leaned closer. Very small letters had been engraved along the inner band. Not names, not a date, only 5 words. "Until the truth is safe." I felt a chill run through me. Even on the day they married, they already knew they were in danger. That meant whatever Thomas had discovered had happened before the wedding. The documents. Everything came back to the documents. Daniel carefully opened the first oilcloth package. Inside were dozens of folded papers. Old accounting records. Company ledgers. Payment receipts. At first glance they meant very little to me. Rows of numbers. Signatures. But Daniel immediately understood what he was seeing. His expression changed. "My father was right. What is it?" He quickly separated several pages. "These companies. They don't exist." He pointed toward one column. "The money left the Henderson accounts. But it never reached the businesses listed here. So where did it go?" He swallowed. "Someone created fake companies. They moved money through them." I looked at another page. Several names appeared repeatedly. One of them immediately caught my attention. Richard Henderson. The same business partner Aunt Louise had mentioned. Daniel kept reading. Then suddenly stopped. "Oh my God! What? There are judges listed." "What do you mean?" He handed me another document. Several large payments had been recorded beside initials instead of names. At the bottom of the page, Thomas had written a note in pencil. Political donations disguised as consulting fees. Even I understood what that meant. This wasn't simple theft. This was corruption. Carefully organized. Hidden behind fake records. No wonder someone wanted the documents. No wonder Margaret had hidden them. Daniel reached for the second oilcloth package. Inside were newspaper clippings. Every one of them involved investigations that had quietly disappeared. Bank fraud. Missing public funds. Construction contracts. None of the cases had ever reached court. At the bottom of one clipping, Margaret had written in blue ink, "This is only one piece." One piece. How many others had existed? Then Daniel unfolded another document. It wasn't an accounting record. It was a handwritten statement signed by Thomas Walker. He began reading aloud. "If anything happens to me, I want it known that Margaret Carter had no part in collecting these documents. Everything was my decision. If anyone is blamed, blame me alone. I couldn't hold back my tears anymore. Even after everything, Thomas had still been trying to protect her, just as she had spent the rest of her life protecting him. Their marriage had lasted only hours. Yet their love had endured for 60 years. Without another word. Without another embrace. Without ever seeing each other again. Daniel quietly folded the statement. I finally understand my father. So do I. For years, I had wondered why Margaret never married. Now I knew. She already had. And in her heart, she always would be. As we carefully returned the documents to the metal box, I noticed something tucked beneath the final layer of oilcloth. Small black cassette tape. Neither of us spoke. The label had faded almost completely. Only one handwritten sentence remained. If the papers are found, listen last. Daniel looked at me. Your sister really thought of everything. I smiled through my tears. She always did. He placed the cassette gently into his backpack. We'll need an old tape player. My husband still has one in the attic. We closed the metal box. Neither of us wanted to leave immediately. Instead, we stood beneath the old oak tree. The wind moved softly through its branches. For a strange moment, I felt as though Margaret and Thomas were finally standing together again. Not in life, but in truth. Then I heard it. An engine. Not far away. Daniel heard it too. We looked toward the narrow road leading to the bridge. The same dark blue sedan slowly appeared between the trees. Stopped about 50 yards away. The driver didn't get out. Another vehicle pulled in behind it. Then another. 3 cars. Exactly 3. Daniel looked at me. They found us. The driver's door of the first sedan opened slowly. The elderly man who had warned us at the diner stepped out. He adjusted his jacket, looked directly at the metal box in Daniel's hands, then smiled. I was hoping you'd save me the trouble of digging. Daniel instinctively tightened his grip on the metal box. I stepped closer to him without thinking. The 3 vehicles remained motionless beneath the shade of the trees. The elderly man closed his car door with surprising calm, as though we were meeting for a scheduled appointment rather than standing in the middle of a 60-year-old mystery. He walked toward us alone. The other drivers stayed inside their cars, watching, waiting. When he was only a few yards away, he stopped. I've been looking for that box for a very long time. His voice was polite, almost gentle. You found what belongs to my family. I looked directly into his eyes. It doesn't belong to your family. It belongs to the truth. For the first time, his pleasant smile faded. The truth, he repeated quietly. People always think the truth makes everything better. It doesn't. It destroys lives. Daniel spoke before I could answer. Your name. The man nodded respectfully. Charles Henderson. The name struck me immediately. Henderson. The same family. The same company. The same corruption Thomas had uncovered. You knew my father, Daniel said. Charles smiled. I knew of him. He was a decent man. A stubborn man. He should have accepted the offer we made. Daniel frowned. What offer? To hand over the documents. And forget what he'd seen. The creek flowed quietly beneath the bridge. Birds continued singing overhead. The world around us carried on as though nothing extraordinary was happening. Yet my entire understanding of my family's past had narrowed into this single conversation. You threatened them, I said. Charles sighed. I warned them. You destroyed their lives. No. They chose that. Daniel took one step forward. My father spent 60 years alone. Charles looked at him with something that almost resembled regret. I know. He was never supposed to. Those words caught both of us off guard. What do you mean? Yes. Charles lowered his eyes for the first time. My father handled everything. I inherited the consequences. Silence settled over us. Then he surprised me. I'm 84 years old. I've buried everyone who made those decisions. My father. My uncles. The lawyers. The accountants. Every one of them. He looked toward the metal box. I don't want what's inside because I'm afraid anymore. I want it because I'm tired. His honesty was unexpected. Too unexpected. I didn't trust it. You've been following us. Yes. You left the warning in my mailbox. Yes. You watched my house. Yes. Why not simply take the diary? Charles smiled faintly. Because Margaret was much smarter than we ever were. He looked directly at me. She wanted us chasing the diary. She knew we'd never stop. The realization sent another chill through me. Even after 60 years, Margaret had continued controlling the game. The diary wasted our time. Charles continued. We searched libraries, storage units, old houses. We even hired private investigators. And all along, he glanced toward the bridge. The truth was sleeping beneath our feet. Daniel shook his head. You could have stopped searching years ago. Charles nodded. I know. But my father never believed he had been outsmarted. He made us promise to keep looking. Another promise. This entire story had become a chain of promises stretching across generations. Some born from love, others from pride. Charles slowly extended one hand. Please, give me the box. Daniel didn't move. No, Charles sighed. I was hoping we could avoid involving lawyers. I almost laughed. Lawyers? After 60 years? He nodded. The documents will create headlines. Investigations. Families dragged through the mud. People who never did anything wrong will suffer. I answered quietly. My sister suffered. So did Thomas. For 60 years. Charles closed his eyes. I know. No. You know the story. You never lived it. For several long moments nobody spoke. Then Charles did something neither Daniel nor I expected. He reached into his coat pocket, slowly, carefully, and removed, not a weapon, not legal papers, an old photograph. He held it out toward me. I recognized it immediately. Margaret, standing beneath the oak tree beside the bridge, smiling, the day before their wedding. I found this among my father's belongings after he died, Charles said. He kept it in his desk. Why? Charles swallowed. I asked him once. And he said, they were the price of my greatest mistake. My anger faltered, not disappeared, but shifted. Charles wasn't defending what had happened. He was carrying the shame of it. My father wanted the documents destroyed. Charles continued. I never did. Daniel frowned. Then why chase them? Because I couldn't allow someone else to find them first. What someone else? Charles looked toward the trees. You think I was the only one searching? Neither of us answered. There were 4 copies, he said quietly. 1 disappeared. 1 was burned. 1 stayed with Thomas. And 1. He looked at the metal box. Margaret hid. I felt my stomach tighten. There are other people. Charles nodded slowly. The people my father worked with had children. And grandchildren. Not all of them accepted the past. Some still believe the documents should never be found. The quiet morning suddenly felt far less peaceful. This wasn't over. Not even close. Charles took one careful step backward. I'm not your enemy, Evelyn. I simply arrived too late. He looked once more at the metal box. If you truly intend to tell the truth, don't go home. The warning surprised me. Why? He glanced toward the road. Because someone else already knows you've opened it. Before I could ask another question, a loud crack echoed through the trees. Not thunder. Not a branch breaking. A gunshot. The bullet struck the wooden bridge behind us, sending splinters flying into the air. Every instinct took over at once. Daniel grabbed my arm. Charles spun toward the road. And somewhere beyond the trees, second shot rang out. The sound of the second gunshot echoed across the creek before I fully understood what was happening. Daniel pulled me behind the massive oak tree with surprising strength. Pieces of bark exploded from the trunk just above our heads. Someone wasn't trying to frighten us anymore. Someone was trying to stop us. Charles Henderson dropped to one knee behind a large boulder several yards away. His calm expression had vanished. He looked toward the tree line with the instincts of a man who immediately recognized real danger. "There!" he shouted. I saw movement. A third shot cracked through the morning air. This one struck the ground only a few feet from the metal box Daniel still held tightly against his chest. "Run!" Charles yelled. "The bridge won't protect you." For a brief second I froze. I was 78 years old. Running through uneven ground beside a creek wasn't something my body welcomed anymore. But fear has a way of making age disappear. Daniel grabbed my hand. We hurried down the creek bank, using the large stones for cover. Behind us, another bullet struck the wooden railing of the bridge. The old structure groaned from the impact. None of us looked back. After nearly 100 yards, the gunfire stopped. Only our breathing disturbed the silence. Daniel helped me sit behind a fallen tree. "Are you hurt?" I shook my head. "No. You?" "I'm all right." Charles arrived only moments later. His breathing was heavier than before, but he appeared unharmed. "They're farther away than I expected." "You know who they are?" Daniel asked. Charles nodded slowly. "I know who sent them." He looked at the metal box. "They've finally realized the documents still exist." I stared at him. "You knew this could happen." "I hoped it wouldn't." "Hoped?" He lowered his eyes. "I thought my warning came soon enough." None of us spoke. The creek flowed quietly beside us, as though the violence belonged to another world. After several minutes, Charles carefully looked toward the bridge again. "They're gone." "Gone?" "Yes. They weren't here to kill us. They were trying to recover the box." Daniel frowned. "How can you know that?" Charles pointed toward the bridge. "If they wanted us dead, they had clearer shots." The realization made my stomach tighten. He was probably right. The bullets had landed close. Too close. As though someone wanted us frightened enough to abandon everything and run. Leaving the box behind, Daniel hugged the metal case against his chest. "They're not getting it." Charles gave a small nod. "Then you need to disappear." I almost laughed. Disappear? My sister disappeared. My father disappeared. Thomas disappeared. I'm tired of people disappearing. Charles looked at me with genuine sadness. "So am I." That answer surprised me. For the first time since meeting him, I saw not a Henderson, but an old man exhausted by the mistakes of generations before him. Daniel broke the silence. "We're not hiding." Charles looked directly at him. "Then publish everything. Today. Immediately. No delays. No hesitation." I looked toward the metal box. Inside rested 60 years of silence. Inside rested my sister's sacrifice. Inside rested Thomas's courage. Those papers no longer belonged to our families. Margaret herself had written that. They belonged to everyone harmed by the lies. "We'll do it," I said quietly. Charles nodded. "Good." Then he reached into his coat one final time. He removed a small brass key. "This opens my father's safety deposit box." Daniel looked confused. "Why are you giving us that?" "Because there is one final piece." Felt my pulse quicken. "What piece?" "My father kept every letter he ever received after 1968. Not from Thomas. From Margaret." My breath caught. "Impossible." "I thought so too." Charles smiled sadly. "They never saw each other again. But they wrote." I stared at him. "For how long?" "Almost 20 years." Neither Daniel nor I spoke. 20 years. 20 years of letters. 20 years of love. 20 years of saying goodbye without ever truly letting go. They agreed never to reveal where either of them lived. Charles continued. They never signed with full names. They never spoke about meeting. They simply— He smiled through tired eyes. Made sure the other was still alive. Tears filled my eyes. All those years, I believed Margaret had spent her life alone. She had. But she had never been abandoned. Every letter had been another heartbeat. Another reminder that somewhere in the world, Thomas still existed. Charles gently closed my fingers around the brass key. My father never destroyed them. He couldn't. Sometimes I think. He paused. He spent the rest of his life wishing he'd made a different choice. The wind moved softly through the branches of the great oak above us. For a strange moment, everything felt peaceful again. Then Daniel looked toward the road. We should leave. He nodded. As we walked back toward our cars, I turned for one last look at the bridge. The place where Margaret and Thomas had said goodbye. The place where they had hidden the truth. The place where two ordinary people had sacrificed an entire lifetime together so that one day, someone else could finally tell their story. I whispered softly into the morning breeze. I understand now. As if the old bridge itself had been waiting all these years. The wind answered with a long, gentle creak through the weathered wooden beams. Somehow, for the first time since opening the diary, I no longer felt as though I was walking behind my sister's shadow. I felt as though she was finally walking beside me. The drive back from Mill Creek was almost silent. Daniel followed my car all the way into town. Neither of us wanted to separate. Not after the gunshots. Not after discovering the documents. Not after learning that Margaret and Thomas had secretly written to each other for nearly 20 years. My quiet little house suddenly no longer felt safe. As soon as we arrived, Daniel parked in my driveway instead of leaving. I don't think you should stay here alone tonight. I was thinking the same thing. We carried the metal box inside together. For the first time since this journey had begun, I wasn't looking at it as a mystery. I was looking at it as evidence. Evidence that two ordinary people had sacrificed everything because they believed the truth mattered more than comfort. Daniel carefully placed the documents across my dining room table. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating page after page of faded ink. Every receipt, every ledger, every handwritten note. Each one represented another piece of a puzzle that had taken us 60 years to uncover. Then I looked at the brass key Charles had given me. The safety deposit box. Another chapter still remained unopened. We should go today, Daniel said. He nodded. If those letters are really there. I don't want to wait. Less than an hour later, we arrived at the old First National Bank downtown. The building looked almost unchanged since the 1960s. Marble floors, tall bronze doors, dark wooden counters polished smooth by generations of customers. The branch manager, a kind woman named Rebecca Collins, greeted us after examining the documents Charles had signed years earlier, authorizing the box to be opened upon his instruction. Everything was legal. Everything had been prepared. Almost as though Charles had been expecting this day for a very long time. She disappeared into the vault. A few minutes later, she returned carrying a small gray metal cassette. Not a tape. A safety deposit drawer. She placed it gently inside a private viewing room. I'll leave you alone. The door closed behind her. Daniel slowly inserted the tiny key. The lock clicked. Inside rested only 3 items. A stack of neatly bundled letters tied together with pale blue ribbon. Small velvet pouch. And a sealed envelope. The envelope immediately caught my attention. Across the front, in Margaret's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "To whoever opens this with Daniel." I looked at him. She knew. He smiled in disbelief. She couldn't possibly. And yet, there it is. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored paper. Dear Evelyn, if Daniel is standing beside you, then Thomas kept his final promise. Please tell him. His father was never alone. Every birthday, Every Christmas, every anniversary, I wrote, even when I never mailed the letter. My vision blurred. I continued reading. There were years when I believed I had done the right thing. There were years when I wished I had been brave enough to choose love instead of fear. I never stopped asking myself whether I had stolen his happiness. If you have found the letters, please read them. Not because they belong to history, but because they belong to forgiveness. I folded the page carefully. Daniel had tears streaming silently down his face. Neither of us spoke. Does it? He untied the pale blue ribbon. The first letter was dated December 24, 1968. Only 6 months after the wedding. Margaret wrote about Snow. About missing him. About wondering whether he still took sugar in his coffee. She never mentioned the investigation. Never mentioned danger. Only ordinary things. The kind of things married couples say every day without realizing how precious they are. The second letter came the following spring. Then another. And another. Year after year. Sometimes 2 pages. Sometimes 10. Sometimes only a birthday wish. Thomas had answered every one. He wrote about his garden. His work. Books he hoped she would enjoy. Music playing on the radio. Neither blamed the other. Not once. Neither asked to meet. Neither questioned the sacrifice they had made. Does it? They quietly chose to love each other from a distance. For almost 20 years. Then Daniel stopped turning the pages. This is the last one. The date read, October 12, 1987. Thomas's handwriting had become shaky. Dear Maggie, the doctor says my heart isn't as strong as it once was. If this becomes my last letter, please don't carry guilt any longer. You gave me years I never should have had. Every sunrise after that bridge was your gift. If there is another life, meet me there. No secrets, no promises, just us. Love always. Thomas. Neither of us could hold back our tears. I carefully looked beneath the letters. The velvet pouch remained. Inside was something wrapped in soft cloth. When I unfolded it, the missing half of the necklace appeared. Not another pendant. Inside the silver heart was a tiny compartment. Daniel looked at me. It opens. Carefully I pressed the hidden hinge. The heart opened with a soft click. Inside rested a tiny folded piece of paper, smaller than a postage stamp. Written in microscopic handwriting were 6 simple words. The truth deserves daylight. Tell everyone. Asterisk asterisk. I closed the pendant slowly. Margaret had left one final instruction. Not to hide. Not to protect. Not to keep another promise. But to end them all. As we sat quietly inside the little bank room, surrounded by 60 years of love letters, I finally understood something that had taken my sister an entire lifetime to teach me. The greatest act of love is not keeping a secret forever. Sometimes, the greatest act of love is knowing exactly when it's time to let the truth be free. When we left the bank that afternoon, neither Daniel nor I spoke for several minutes. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to guess. Only one responsibility remained. To decide what to do with everything Margaret and Thomas had protected for so many years. The documents, the letters, the diary, the photographs, the cassette tape. Every piece now rested safely inside Daniel's backpack. As we reached the parking lot, he looked at me. What would Margaret do? I smiled sadly. She already told us. The truth deserves daylight. He nodded. Then we need people who know how to protect it. I agreed immediately. Neither of us wanted newspapers chasing dramatic headlines. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about humiliating families. It was about placing the evidence where it belonged, in the hands of professionals. That evening we contacted a retired federal investigator recommended by one of Daniel's former co-workers. His name was Harold Simmons. He had spent more than 30 years investigating financial crimes before retiring. He agreed to meet us the following morning. When we arrived at his office, Harold greeted us with the careful skepticism of someone who had heard many unbelievable stories. I'll be honest, he said. Most people who walk through that door believe they've uncovered history. They usually haven't. Daniel quietly placed the documents on his desk. You decide. Harold adjusted his reading glasses. He examined the first ledger, then the second, then Thomas's handwritten notes. Within minutes, his expression changed completely. He stopped speaking. For almost an hour, the only sounds in the room were pages turning. Finally, he removed his glasses. I've seen investigations reopened after 40 years. I've never seen evidence preserved this carefully after 60. I looked at him. So? He leaned back slowly. Your sister understood chain of custody better than many investigators. He frowned. What does that mean? It means she handled these documents in a way that preserved their credibility. He pointed toward the oilcloth wrapping. Minimal moisture. No unnecessary markings. Original notes separated from copies. He looked genuinely impressed. She wanted these to survive. Daniel asked quietly, "Can anything still be done?" Harold thought for several moments. The people responsible are almost certainly gone. We know. But institutions remain. Records remain. Victims' families remain. He closed the final folder. This deserves to be officially archived. Not sensationalized. Not sold. Not hidden again. Those words brought me unexpected peace. For the first time since opening the diary, I felt the weight beginning to lift. Harold carefully packed every document into protective archival folders. Then he looked toward the letters. And these? I answered without hesitation. They're family. He smiled. They belong with you. On the drive home, Daniel seemed quieter than usual. Finally he spoke. I've been thinking about my father. So have I. I spent my whole childhood believing he regretted something. He did. But not what I imagined. He looked out the window. He wasn't regretting Margaret. He was grieving the life they never had. I reached across the console and gently squeezed his hand. So was she. When we returned to my house, the late afternoon sun poured through the dining room windows. Everything looked ordinary again. The same table, the same clock, the same curtains. Yet I felt like a different woman. I walked upstairs carrying the diary one final time. Back to my bedroom. Back to the wooden box. For several minutes I simply looked at it. 10 years. That was how long I had protected something I never truly understood. No, finally did. Carefully, I wrote one sentence on a small card. Opened by Evelyn Carter. July 2026. With love. And with forgiveness. Asterisk asterisk. I placed the card inside the front cover before gently closing the diary. Not to hide it, but to complete its journey. When I returned downstairs, Daniel stood looking at one of the old family photographs. The one where someone had cut Thomas out. He held it silently. Then he smiled. I think it's time. He removed the damaged photograph from its frame. Carefully scanned it with his phone. Then opened the restored copy we had created earlier using another complete photograph from the metal box. Within minutes, Thomas stood beside Margaret once again. Exactly where he had always belonged. No missing space. No empty outline. No erased history. I stared at the restored photograph for a long time. Sometimes healing doesn't change the past. Sometimes, it simply allows us to finally see it as it truly was. That evening, Daniel prepared to leave. Before getting into his car, he handed me a small envelope. I almost forgot. What is it? My father kept this in his wallet. Inside was the tiny receipt from the florist who had prepared Margaret's wedding bouquet. Across the back, Thomas had written only one sentence. She smiled all morning. Nothing more. No dramatic declaration. No grand speech. Just one simple memory. The kind only a man deeply in love would choose to carry for the rest of his life. As Daniel drove away, I stood on my front porch watching the sunset. For the first time in many years, The silence around my house no longer felt lonely, felt peaceful, because somewhere, beyond every unanswered question, beyond every broken promise, Margaret's story was finally becoming whole. The following morning I woke earlier than usual. For the first time in days, I hadn't been awakened by fear. No strange cars, no mysterious phone calls, no footsteps outside my window. Only birds singing beneath the maple tree outside my bedroom. I made coffee and carried my favorite mug onto the front porch. The air felt lighter, not because the story had ended, but because I had finally stopped carrying it alone. As I watched the neighborhood slowly come to life, I noticed something waiting beside the front door. A small cardboard package. No shipping company. No return address. Only my name written neatly in blue ink. For one brief moment my heart tightened. Then I smiled. Not every unexpected package had to be another warning. Carried it inside. Daniel arrived only 20 minutes later. I saw your message. I didn't open it. Good. We placed the package on the dining room table. It wasn't heavy. Inside, wrapped carefully in newspaper, rested an old wooden picture frame. Nothing more. No letter. No explanation. Just the frame. First I thought someone had sent it by mistake. Then I turned it over. On the back was a faded label. Walker Photography Studio. Daniel froze. My father. I looked up. He used to develop photographs himself. Carefully we removed the backing. Hidden behind the empty mat was another photograph. Not Margaret. Not Thomas. The chapel. But this time, someone had taken the picture from inside the church. Margaret and Thomas stood at the altar holding hands. The minister smiled warmly. And behind them, sitting quietly in the last pew, was a young man holding a camera. Daniel pointed immediately. That's Samuel. It was much younger, of course, but unmistakably the same man who had visited my house. On the bottom edge of the photograph, written in tiny handwriting, were the words, "Every story deserves one witness." Smiled. Samuel had kept that promise. For 60 years. Daniel carefully placed the photograph back inside the frame. I think he wanted us to have this. So do I. Later that afternoon, Harold Simmons called. I wanted you both to know something. What is it? I've contacted the state archives. They've agreed to preserve every document. I felt relief wash over me. They'll also include a written history explaining exactly how the records survived. Without sensational headlines. Without speculation. Only facts. Exactly what Margaret would have wanted. Truth. Not revenge. That evening, Daniel and I drove one last time to the cemetery. Margaret rested beneath a simple gray granite headstone. Fresh flowers already stood beside it. Neither of us had brought them. Someone else had. I looked around. No one was nearby. Only the wind moving gently through the old cedar trees. Daniel quietly placed the restored photograph beside the flowers for a moment. I wish he could have seen this. I knew he wasn't talking only about Thomas. He meant his father, Samuel, even Charles. All the people whose lives had been shaped by one terrible decision made generations earlier. I gently rested my hand against Margaret's headstone. I kept your promise as long as I could. My voice trembled. And then, I finally understood why you wanted it broken. Tears rolled silently down my cheeks. Not tears of grief. Tears of release. Daniel stood quietly beside me. After several minutes he spoke. I think she'd be proud of you. I smiled softly. I hope she'd forgive me. He looked at the diary resting inside my bag. I think she already has. As we turned to leave, I noticed an elderly woman walking slowly toward us carrying fresh daisies. She stopped at the neighboring grave. Then looked toward Margaret's name. I knew her. I smiled politely. You did. She nodded. We worked together at the library years ago. There was something she always said. My heart skipped. What was that? The woman smiled as though hearing Margaret's voice once again. The truth doesn't disappear. Sometimes. It simply waits until someone is ready to carry it. Neither Daniel nor I answered. We didn't need to. Because after everything we had uncovered, we finally understood exactly what she meant. As we walked back toward the car, the late afternoon sunlight stretched across the cemetery. Long shadows reached gently across the grass. For the first time since this journey began, those shadows no longer felt like ghosts from the past. They felt like quiet reminders that love can outlive fear, that sacrifice can outlive silence, and that some promises are only meant to last until the truth is finally safe. A week passed before life began to resemble something ordinary again. Not the same life I had known before. That woman no longer existed. She had believed that silence always honored love. Now I understood that love sometimes asks us to speak. The documents had already been transferred to the state archives. Harold called every few days with quiet updates. Everything was moving exactly as planned. Professional historians had begun reviewing the records. Financial investigators were comparing the names and companies listed in Thomas's notes with surviving public records. No dramatic headlines. No television cameras parked outside my home. Just patient, careful work. Exactly the way Margaret would have wanted. One afternoon, Daniel arrived carrying a large cardboard box. I found these while cleaning my father's attic. He placed it gently on my dining room table. Inside were dozens of photo albums. Most contained ordinary family moments. Fishing trips, birthday cakes, snowstorms, gardens. But every few pages, there was another photograph of Margaret. Not secretly taken. Not hidden. Simply preserved. There she was reading beneath a tree. Laughing beside a lake. Holding a basket of apples. Watching autumn leaves fall across a quiet park. She looked older in each photograph. Yet every time, she was alone. Or so I thought. Daniel smiled. Look carefully. I leaned closer. In the background of one picture, far across the park, a man sat reading on another bench. Another photograph showed Margaret standing beside a bookstore window. Across the street, Thomas stood outside a bakery. Neither looked toward the other. Neither stood together. Somehow, they had chosen the same place. The same afternoon. The same season. Again and again. I turned another page. The pattern continued. Botanical garden. A county fair. A lakeside walking trail. Always separated. Always careful. Always close enough to know the other was alive. Never close enough to break the promise. I looked at Daniel in disbelief. They saw each other. He nodded slowly. I don't think they planned to. I think they simply learned each other's routines. The realization broke my heart all over again. For years, they had quietly shared the same world. Choosing distance. Choosing safety. Choosing love. Every photograph carried the same invisible sentence. I'm here. I'm all right. Keep living. Near the back of the final album, something slipped onto the table. Folded map. Pennsylvania. Several small towns had been circled in blue pencil. Each circle matched a photograph. Park. The garden. The bookstore. The fairgrounds. Margaret and Thomas hadn't been meeting. They had been passing through the same places at different moments. Close enough to feel connected. Far enough to remain safe. Daniel laughed softly through his tears. My father always took long drives on Sunday. So did Margaret. Neither of them had been wandering without purpose. They had been keeping a silent appointment. One that required no words. No embraces. Only hope. Hope that somewhere nearby, the other still existed. At the bottom corner of the map, Thomas had written one final note. Fate is kind. We'll breathe the same air today. I had to close the album for a moment. Some love stories are remembered because they end with weddings. Others are remembered because they survive without one. Late that evening, after Daniel had gone home, I sat alone in the living room. The restored photograph of Margaret and Thomas stood on the fireplace mantel. Beside it rested the repaired silver necklace. The heart pendant closed once more. Whole again. Just like the photograph. Just like the story. I found myself smiling. Not because everything had ended happily. It hadn't. Margaret and Thomas lost an entire lifetime together. Nothing could change that. But they had never lost what mattered most. They never stopped believing in each other. Before going to bed, I opened my mailbox. Inside was a single envelope. This one carried a proper stamp. Return address. State Archives of Pennsylvania. I smiled before opening it. Inside was a formal letter thanking our family for preserving historical records of significant public value. At the bottom was a handwritten note from Harold Simmons. History rarely remembers ordinary people. Your sister made sure this time it would. I carefully folded the letter. Then placed it inside the wooden box beside Margaret's diary. Not as another secret, but as the final proof that her 60 years of waiting had not been in vain. For the first time since I was a little girl, I looked toward the night sky. And instead of wondering what my sister had been hiding, I quietly thanked her for trusting that one day I would be strong enough to tell her story. Nearly 3 months passed before I returned to Mill Creek. Autumn had painted the hills with deep shades of gold, amber, and crimson. The old covered bridge looked almost unchanged. The great oak tree still stretched its branches across the creek, as though guarding every memory buried beneath it. This time I wasn't alone. Daniel stood beside me carrying a small wooden box. Inside rested only 3 things. The repaired silver necklace, a copy of the restored wedding photograph, and a single white rose. We walked slowly toward the oak tree. Neither of us hurried. Some places deserve silence more than conversation. When we reached the stone beneath which the metal box had been hidden for so many years, Daniel knelt. He carefully placed the white rose beside it. I think this is where their story truly ended, he whispered. I smiled gently. No, I think this is where it finally began. The breeze carried fallen leaves across the creek. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel reached into his jacket pocket. I've been meaning to show you something. He handed me a folded newspaper. Not an old one. A recent edition. Inside, a small article appeared near the bottom of one page. Historic financial records officially added to State Archive collection. There were no dramatic headlines. No photographs. Only a quiet acknowledgement that documents preserved by 2 private citizens had helped historians correct part of the public record surrounding a long-forgotten financial investigation from the late 1960s. No names were mentioned. Not Margaret. Not Thomas. Not Henderson. Exactly as Harold had promised. Truth without spectacle. Justice without revenge. I folded the newspaper carefully. I think Margaret would have liked this. So would my father. Daniel looked toward the bridge. I've been thinking about something. What? If they had stayed together, what kind of life would they have had? I smiled sadly. We'll never know. And maybe we're not supposed to. Sometimes imagining the life we didn't live only steals joy from the one we still have. Daniel nodded quietly. I suppose you're right. Before leaving, I opened the small wooden box. I lifted the repaired necklace. The morning sunlight reflected softly from the tiny silver heart. For years it had existed in 2 separate pieces. One with Margaret. One with Thomas. No, it was whole again. I hung it gently over a low tree branch beside the oak. Not as an offering. Not as a memorial. Simply as a symbol. Some things deserve to return to the place where their story began. As we walked back toward the car, I turned for one final look. The necklace moved gently in the wind, catching little flashes of sunlight between the leaves. For just a second, it almost looked as though someone had smiled. A week later, I received another visitor. This time it wasn't a stranger. It was Susan, my daughter. She carried fresh apple pie through the front door before giving me the kind of hug only daughters can give. You seem different. I am. She laughed. I knew you'd finally admit it. Over lunch, she noticed the restored wedding photograph sitting on the fireplace. I've never seen this before. You haven't? Who's the man beside Aunt Margaret? For years, that question would have terrified me. No, made me smile. His name was Thomas. He was the love of her life. Susan looked surprised. I never knew. Neither did I. She stared at the photograph for a long time, then quietly asked, "What happened?" I looked toward the diary resting peacefully inside the wooden box, then back at my daughter. They kept a promise. For far too long. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I'm glad you finally found the truth. So am I. That evening, after Susan had gone home, I sat alone beside the fireplace. The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt empty. I picked up Margaret's diary one last time. Not to read it, only to hold it. I gently ran my fingers across the worn leather cover, then smiled. You were right. I was ready. For the first time in 18 years. I returned the diary to its wooden box. Not because I wanted to hide it. Because its work was finally finished. Some stories spend decades waiting for someone willing to listen. Others spend decades waiting for someone brave enough to tell them. Margaret's story had finally found its voice. Winter arrived quietly that year. The first snowfall covered the rooftops just before Christmas, turning the neighborhood into the same peaceful scene Margaret used to describe in her letters. I found myself thinking about her almost every day. Not with sadness anymore. With gratitude. One afternoon, a large envelope arrived from the Pennsylvania State Archives. Inside was a beautifully bound report. Its cover was simple. No dramatic title. No photographs. Only a modest inscription. Historical Financial Records Collection. Walker/Carter Preservation Archive. I smiled the moment I saw those names together. Walker, Carter, side by side. Exactly as they should have been all along. I spent the afternoon reading through the report. The investigators had confirmed nearly everything Thomas had documented. Several long-forgotten public contracts had been quietly corrected in the historical record. A handful of families finally learned why businesses their grandparents had trusted had suddenly collapsed decades earlier. No criminal trials followed. There couldn't be. Time had already delivered its own verdict. History had finally been corrected. As evening approached, I placed the report beside Margaret's diary. One had protected the truth. The other had preserved it. Together, they had completed a journey that lasted more than half a century. A few days later, Daniel invited me to lunch. We returned to the same little diner where our lives had changed forever. The waitress recognized us immediately. Well, she laughed, setting 2 cups of coffee on the table. You both look much happier than the last time. Daniel smiled. We are. She looked at me. Did you find what you were searching for? I thought for a moment before answering. No. I found something much better. What was that? Understanding. She nodded as though that answer made perfect sense. Before leaving, she handed me a small envelope. I almost forgot. Someone asked me to give you this if you ever came back. There wasn't any name. I've been keeping it in the register for weeks. After she walked away, I carefully opened it. Inside was a folded note. Only one sentence had been written. Some promises end. Love never does. ***. No signature. None was needed. Daniel looked at the handwriting. I think Samuel left it. I think you're right. We both smiled. Neither of us ever saw Samuel Bennett again. A few months later, Harold told us that he had passed away peacefully in his sleep. His family said he had spoken often during his final weeks about 2 people who had finally come home. I knew exactly who he meant. Spring arrived. Flowers bloomed again. Life moved forward. Susan visited more often. Daniel became part of our family in a way neither of us had expected. Not because we shared blood. Because we shared the responsibility of remembering. One Saturday afternoon, my youngest granddaughter wandered into the living room while I was dusting the fireplace. She pointed toward the restored wedding photograph. "Grandma, who are they?" Smiled. "That's my sister. And that's the man she loved." The little girl tilted her head. "Did they live happily ever after?" Children have a way of asking the hardest questions with the simplest words. I thought carefully before answering. They didn't live the life they dreamed of. But they never stopped loving each other. She seemed to think about that, then smiled. "I think that's still a happy ending." I kissed the top of her head. "So do I." That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone beside the fireplace one last time. The diary rested on my lap. Its pages no longer frightened me. Its secrets no longer belonged only to the past. Slowly, I opened to the very last page. One sentence had been written there. A sentence I had somehow overlooked. Perhaps because I hadn't been ready before. It read, "If this story reaches its ending, don't remember us for what we lost. Remember us for what we refused to surrender." Asterisk asterisk. Below it, Margaret had signed her full name. And for the first time, beneath her signature, peered another, Thomas Walker. 2 signatures, on the same page. At last. Closed the diary gently. Outside, snow began falling once more. Quiet. Almost exactly as Margaret had once described it. I carried the diary upstairs and placed it inside the wooden box for the final time. Not because it needed to be hidden. Because it had finally come home. Before turning off the bedroom light, I looked once toward the window. For a brief moment, I imagined 2 young people standing beneath an old oak tree beside a covered bridge. Not saying goodbye. Not running from fear. Simply smiling at each other the way they had in that forgotten photograph. History almost erased them. Time almost buried them. Silence almost defeated them. Love waited patiently. Until someone was finally willing to listen. Now, as long as their story is remembered, neither Margaret Carter, nor Thomas Walker, will ever truly be forgotten. If you've stayed with me until this moment, thank you. Not for listening to my story, for carrying it with me. When my sister placed that old diary into my hands 18 years ago, I believed she was asking me to protect a secret. I understand now. She was asking me to protect hope. Hope that one day the world would become safe enough for the truth. Hope that someone would finally understand why 2 people could spend an entire lifetime apart and still belong to each other. For years, I thought love was measured by the time people spent together. Margaret taught me something different. Sometimes love is measured by the promises we keep. Sometimes, by the promises we are finally brave enough to let go. I often wonder what my sister and Thomas would think if they could see us now. Their names finally spoken together. Their photograph finally restored. Their story finally complete. Perhaps they would simply smile. Not because justice arrived, but because the silence finally ended. As for me, I still keep the wooden box in my bedroom. The diary rests inside it. Not as a secret anymore. As a reminder. A reminder that every person we meet carries chapters we know nothing about. That kindness is often the greatest gift we can offer another human being. And that the truth, no matter how deeply it is buried, has a remarkable way of finding the light. If this story touched your heart, I hope you'll carry one small lesson with you. Never assume you know someone's entire life simply because you've seen a few chapters. The most important pages are often the ones people never had the chance to read. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take good care of the people you love. Say the words you've been postponing. Forgive when your heart is ready. And never underestimate the quiet strength of an ordinary person who chooses to do the right thing. My name is Evelyn. And this was the story my sister trusted me to finish. Good night. And may every forgotten story someday find someone willing to remember it.